Let's get started. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for coming to Body Talk, Fatphobia in the Age of Ozempic. My name is Moira Donegan. I am the writer in residence at the Clayman Institute for Gender Research, which is sponsoring this conversation today. Before we get started, I really wanted to send my thanks to Kendra, Jessica, and Laura at Clayman, who helped make this happen and who found us room big enough for everybody who RSVP'd. I am really thrilled to be here, and I am so thrilled that you're all here with us. So, I was thinking on the drive down to campus this morning that it is a privilege of my job here at Stanford that I am kind of frequently in personal conversations with somebody who wrote something that changed my life. It's just one of the insane parts of this job. And this still feels special, right? Because Virgie and Jessica's writing has really completely changed the way that I understand the politics of bodies and appearances. They are uniquely insightful, compassionate, funny writers. We're really in the presence of greatness here. I think part of why we had such a good RSVP and registration for this event is because their writing and their reputations precede them. So really thank you guys both so much for being here. It is such an honor and a real coup that we got you. I was very smug that I got you guys to agree to come. So thank you so much. And I think that there's really nobody I would rather be talking to about fat phobia and semaglutide drugs and the ways that this new class of medication has changed our politics of bodies than the two of you. So we're in a moment now where since Ozempic and its sister drug, Wegovy, were approved for weight loss purposes by the FDA in 2021, what had been this sort of late aughts, nascent, partial, but I think really in many ways revolutionary discourse of body positivity and fat liberation and fat acceptance has gotten sort of this odd bit of rhetorical competition from the emergence of these new drugs and the immense demand for them, which has revived a set of understandings or assumptions about fatness and thinness and bodies as having sort of these moral qualities and being signifiers of moral status. So I think right now, what I want to do is go into some questions that I don't really have the answers to. I'm a pundit and they tell me to never ask a question that I don't know the answer to. That's my day job, but here we get to be a little more nuanced and ambivalent and uncertain, because I wanted to talk to you guys about these things that I don't totally understand. And I think a lot of people who are watching and listening with us today don't totally understand, which is what do these drugs mean about the thorny issues of shame, stigma, acceptance, status, and bias, what it means for an individual solution to be offered on a market to address a social problem, what it means to navigate embodiment in a context of bigotry, and how to handle competing claims of personal autonomy and social solidarity. So I think that these are basically the two women most equipped maybe in the world to help us sort through this. And I'm just so happy that they're there. So I'm going to read their bios so you guys, in case you somehow don't know who they are, can understand that we're, really in the presence of greatness here. So Virgie Tovar, to my left, is a plus-size Latina author, lecturer, and leading expert on weight-based discrimination and body positivity. After building an academic foundation at the intersections of body, size, race, and gender, Tovar went on to write You Have the Right to Remain Fat, 2018, The Self-Love Revolution, Radical Body Positivity for Girls of Color, 2020, The Body Positive Journal, 2022, and the Substack vertical, Voluminati. And I love that title. I think it's so great. And then to my right is Jessica DeFino, who is an award-winning beauty reporter whose work has appeared in the New York Times, The Guardian, Vice, and more. She writes the newsletter, The Review of Beauty, and has been called the woman the beauty industry fears. I love that. By the Sunday Herald. These are people who are, really compassionate and attentive to what these intersections of politics and power on our bodies mean for people's intimate experiences and their self-concept. But you are also something I really admire about both of you is that you're never afraid to like challenge and provoke your audiences. So I'm really excited to have you both in conversation. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much
Thank
for having us.
you.
So I think I wanted to start off by placing us in time and placing your work in a little bit of historical context. So maybe Virgie, I'll start with you and we can move on to you, Jess. How did you start writing about body politics and what did the world of body positivity or fat acceptance look like when your career started out?
Yeah, I mean, I was in graduate school and I was in a sexuality studies program. I had been a sex educator before then and had been really interested in the sort of sociology of sexuality, et cetera, and the social construction of sexuality. And it was in that program that I ended up realizing that I was very interested in looking at weight stigma. As someone who had experienced weight stigma my entire life, and specifically I was interested in how weight stigma and racism and obviously sexism mediated gender performance and gender trajectories in women of color. So I ended up doing a very small qualitative analysis with about maybe 12 participants. And I found that I was interviewing people who were mostly cisgender women, some of them queer, some of them straight, but they all had extremely sophisticated gender scripts, which is very unusual for a cisgender person. Maybe not very unusual, I would say quite unusual. And so I was like, okay, wow, there's an awareness of gender that is unusual. And it had to do, and I mean, as someone who experienced fat phobia myself from in childhood, I really resonated with that because I was extremely confused about my gender as a child. Because I'm being raised as a girl, as a female, socialized as a female. However, I'm not getting any of the social cues that are part of the social side of gender performance or gender education. So like, I'm being shown that girls get treated like delicate flowers. I wasn't being treated that way. I was getting punched by like my boy peers. I was not considered sexually or romantically. I was not somebody was like, oh, I want to be your husband someday. I was not treated that way. I couldn't find clothing in the gendered clothing areas that were supposed to be for me. My doctor, I think what's interesting is like, I was getting the messaging that girls get treated like this by every outlet in the culture, but I wasn't getting those messages, which created gender confusion. So I was interested in the research to find if that was replicated, and the answer was in my sort of group of participants, the answer was yes. So in that process of doing that research, I of course had to do this very extensive literature review, and I ended up finding about fat activism sort of by accident. And if you haven't heard of fat activism, it's been around since the 1960s. And it's existed, in like places like the Bay Area, New York, the Pacific Northwest. There are sort of these outposts. And at that time, it was extremely grassroots. It was very old school activism, right? Where you're like, and I mean, as someone who's been an activist since, I'm an old millennial, so I'm 42. I became an activist probably like at 18 years old in college. And I sort of know the old school networking of like grassroots activists. Like you have to be kind of jumped there. You have to be vouched for. Like you have to be kind of vetted, and then somebody's got to vouch for you, and then okay, you're in if you make the vouch, and then you're all of a sudden you're like completely dropped all the way down into this like magical world, this alternative universe. So for me, fat activism was like that. It was like I was doing this research, somebody found out about it, somebody was like, have you heard about this fat conference? It's happening in Oakland in like 3 weeks. And they're like, you got to go. And I'm like, how do you guys even know what I'm doing? It was like this kind of, again, this underworld of networked information. And so I end up at the conference, and that moment completely changes my life. I'm not only introduced to the concept of like, the principles of fat activism are like fat people deserve human rights, right? Like they're very, 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 very foundational. Fat people deserve to have equal access to medical care, that there's nothing wrong with being fat. There's actual body diversity. There's always been larger bodied people. There's always been, people in smaller bodies and this range of people, and really looking at the human rights violations that are inherent to fat phobia. I mean, they're just staggering. Like the fact that higher weight people get less preventive medical care, the fact that higher weight people make less money. The fact that higher weight people experience romantic discrimination, public transportation discrimination. I mean, the list is very, very extensive. And also part of it was critiquing diet culture. It was like, look at what this industry has done to us. And it has, you know, and it's scapegoat. It's like, it's used us as this boogeyman to sell product. And it's destroyed so many of our lives in the process because we've taken the product. We've lived our lives trying to lose weight. We've gone through the cardiovascular distress of starvation and being forced into survival mode, which is what dieting does. And if you're in a higher weight, if you're in a larger body, there doesn't seem to, it's almost like carte blanche. Nobody cares what happens to you as long as you're thinner. No one has any questions. So I'm like, just to give you a little bit of context, like I'm 11 years old. I was introduced to fat phobia at the age of like 4 or 5. By 11, I'm already starving myself. I'm already on the pathway to an eating disorder. And you know, I'm starving myself for months on end. And my doctor's like, what are you doing? Keeping up, no questions asked here. If you keep going, you could maybe date one of my sons, right? So, you know, I think, and in that, I think there's so much to say about rape culture and sexism and compulsive, you know, compulsory heterosexuality that are part of fat phobia that are like in there embedded. But anyway, moving on like that. So I'm in graduate school. There's enough of traction that there's like these gatherings, there's conferences and things like that. And there's you know, there's like, I don't want to say hundreds, but like dozens of larger body people who have decided to stop dieting, who are like, I'm not apologizing for my size. I'm going to wear a bikini. I'm going to live my best life. I'm going to date 5 people. It just was like, it was like this, it wasn't just like a world where higher body people were accepted or considered with neutrality. It was a world where it was like, this is a celebration to be in this body. And it was so political and gorgeous. And there was such a sense of vitality at the time. And I knew it was like that sense of like the boiling pot. Like I could feel the energy and I knew that this was about to change the culture. And so that's kind of the moment that I started doing this work. And I think like I'm finishing graduate school and I'm immediately kind of I'm writing about it. I'm in the, you know, lecturing about it, trying to write books about it. And at that time, body positivity hadn't really even been born yet. I'll stop there. Yeah.
That is such a wonderful introduction. I loved your portrait of this like counterculture, this like small pocket of people who are self-consciously rejecting the conventional wisdom. Do you know exactly about what the year was when you went to that conference?
Yeah, it was 2010. Yeah.
2010. Yeah, that pivotal moment. And I remember that historical moment too. It did feel like it was bubbling underneath. Jessica, how about you? How did you start writing about the politics of beauty, wellness, appearance?
Well, I started writing about the politics of beauty and appearance after a career doing sort of the opposite. 2015, 2016, I was hired to be an assistant editor on the Kardashian-Jenner official apps. And so I was working with the Kardashian-Jenner sisters to create beauty and fashion content for their apps. And I mean, I had been obsessed with beauty my whole life, and this felt like a dream job, and I was so excited to have it. I had not really read much about the politics of beauty or even feminism up until that point. And I think I would like have considered myself a feminist doing a feminist job in the fact that it was like, oh, these women are billionaires and they're at the top of the world and they're doing their thing and that's exciting for them and exciting for me to work for them. So it felt really great for a time. And then I started to just feel like something was off after about a year of working in this environment and like sort of being part of the machine that like created beauty standards and sold them to an audience. This was right when Kylie Jenner was launching her lip kit. And so that was one of those moments of discomfort for me where, you know, Kylie Jenner was clearly getting lip fillers. She wasn't saying she had created this lip product that was like a lipstick and a gloss that you put on top and telling people this is how you look like me. And it was like, well, that's not, and you're making millions of dollars. Chloe's content, we were writing things like how to fake a nose job with makeup, and she had an actual nose job. We had a full-time Photoshop artist on the apps, but we were creating content with Kim that was like, here's how to face tune your face with makeup. So it was just like smoke and mirrors. And I think I really started to question it out of my own vanity because I was on the receiving end of a lot of beauty PR for the first time in my life. So I was getting all these expensive products and using them, and I had a horrible reaction to them. My skin, I developed dermatitis. My skin basically started peeling off of my face. I couldn't use skincare. I couldn't wear makeup. I was just like, kind of like the monster at the end of The Substance that everyone was scared of. Like people in the office were like, are you contagious before I get on the elevator with you? And I just realized like, wow, when I don't have this like veneer of beauty that I've put my whole life into creating, I actually feel absolutely worthless, and I'm treated like I'm absolutely worthless, and something doesn't add up here. So I sort of had this like radicalizing moment where I was like, I need to take a step back and look at what I've been doing my whole life and maybe atone for it a little bit. I think my career now is like a bit of an apology.
I love these like photo negative origin stories, right? Like one experience of belonging and inclusion, maybe after like experiencing a culture of exclusion and cruelty, right? Like you got sort of initiated into like a different value system in which you could be loved, right? At this conference. And you got, sorry, like horrified by this other side of our culture of beauty. Jessica, I'm really fascinated that you bring up the Kardashians, because I think of them, as a lot of people do, I think, as this touchstone of the revision of beauty standards in the 2000s, right? The move from the 90s and early aughts popular culture beauty ideal of extreme thinness to one of greater curves, which were embodied by the Kardashians, that sort of plundered from some kind of racist depictions of Black women's anatomy, and also were, you know, about the distribution of fat and where fat was desirable, right? I feel like that's something that really changes in ways that can be tracked according to political trends, right? Where fat is okay, what fat is okay. But at the same time, it created a permission structure, the Kardashians' ideal of a particular curvy body, both create a permission structure for a kind of a variety of fat acceptance to enter more mainstream discourses, and also created a new ideal that required a lot of artifice, a lot of effort, and a lot of money. So Virgie, do you want to talk about the changing body rhetorics and ideals of the 2010s? And then Jess, we can move back to you.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm drawn in by the theme of changing of the guard. And I kind of want to talk a little bit about that. Like, I mean, I wrote a piece probably, I don't know, it probably was a year ago now, where I talked about the transition from spandex to lab coats, how we're watching a very important moment in beauty history and in diet culture in particular, where for many, many years, the face of exercise, the face of legitimate health and thinness, et cetera, the bona fides were that you were thin, that you were athletic, that you were white, that you were able-bodied, and that you were probably some level of wealthy or otherwise, you know, have some claim to celebrity. And those were the bona fides that were required to be an influencer, a tastemaker, an expert in the fitness space. And now with sort of the dawn of GLP-1s, now that drag is different. It's lab coats, it's masculine, and it's got sort of the bona fides come from, you know, the American Medical Association, from sort of the respectability of the money of pharmaceuticals. And I think this is sort of an interesting other thing where it speaks to kind of, right, like I think, right, what activists always have on our side is that we're small and that we're nimble. So we can maneuver very, very quickly. We don't have red tapes. We don't have a board of directors, you know, theoretically. And these huge systems and structures, one of their biggest flaws is that they're cumbersome. It takes a long time and there's rigidity and there's red tape. However, there's enough flexibility that the system can know when the changing of the guard is strategically a good idea. And I think, you know, in the same way that we moved from spandex to lab coats, we went from, I think, this sort of spandex type of beauty, that very specific sort of white, heterofeminine kind of beauty, to this more sort of racially coded, Potentially, like, it had enough flexibility that you could claim body positivity. And I think this is where you see, I think what's so challenging in being in this work for so long is like, the rhetoric is slippery and the system is very quick to kind of adopt them and sort of find these little, find where the supposed potential weaknesses are and to go in and co-opt them. I have so much more to say about that, but I'll just leave that question there.
What was the question again? I'm just trying to think of like how to frame what
I'm interested in how in the 2010s,
Yes, okay.
changing beauty standards allowed for a pretext of body
Right.
positivity to
Yeah.
coexist along with the real movement that Virgie was talking about
Yeah.
in these weight loss and beauty industries.
Right. I think the Kardashians were emblematic of this, where because they were curvier, it was praised as body positive, it was praised as representation. It was, see, all body types can be beautiful, except that's not really the case, right? It was still a very specific type of body, a very specific look, and it was these features that were sort of co-opted from marginalized communities and grafted onto stereotypically beautiful white bodies, making it this impossible ideal for anyone to achieve, really. Like, it required a lot of aesthetic labor for anyone to achieve this ideal. It drew like a lot of class lines of who can afford to embody this ideal as well. And at the time, as it was being championed as this sort of like inclusive new face of beauty standards, I think the thing that I kept coming back to is like, the point is not to change the beauty standard. We want to abolish a standard. Like, a standard is not good for us, no matter what the standard is, whether that's super curvy, whether that's like heroin chic. The idea is that there should not be a standard that we are all measured against. And I feel like that's something that speaking from like a media lens, because that's where I was in, that's what the media really glommed onto. And I think that's what like the average viewer trying to figure out what was happening in this body positive space really glommed onto, as a comfort almost. Because I think when there's a standard, there's always like that hope that like, I can fit it, I can be it. Yeah, and I think we've seen that obviously change in this moment now, where it really wasn't championing inclusivity or diversity. As soon as these icons of the culture decided they wanted to slim down again and reclaim the features that are stereotypically white, the culture has followed too. And what we thought was inclusivity is actually like not considered attractive or beautiful or worthy of representation in the media anymore. And it's like, that's part of this, like, why changing the standard can't just be the point. It has to be getting rid of the standard.
I love that shift in perspective, and this might bring us up to 2021 and the FDA's approval of Wegovy. So for those of you who aren't familiar with this new class of drugs, they're called semaglutides. I read it as semaglutide about 1 million times, and then I finally heard somebody in a white lab coat who seemed to know more than me say semaglutide. So that's what I'm going to go with. And they are a class of drugs that mimic a satiety hormone, right? So when these drugs are injected, they create the sensation of physical fullness. It's a physiological sensation, and there's some evidence that it also creates a psychological condition of feeling full, satisfied, no longer desiring, particularly of food. This drug, Ozempic, was approved by the FDA in 2017 for treatment of type 2 diabetes, where it seems to be like quite successful so far. However, one of its main side effects was weight loss. And so Novo Nordisk, the Dutch pharmaceutical company that owns the patent on Ozempic, tweaked the dosage, increased the dosage a little bit, created the sister drug Wegovy, and lots of people started clamoring to use that for weight loss. And in fact, now there's a large shortage of Ozempic itself because lots of people are trying to use it off-label. So Virgie, I wanted to talk to you about what changed for the body positivity movement after the introduction of this. And then maybe we can all talk a little bit about what we think made thinness an appealing aspiration at this particular political moment. So let's dig in.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of want to go back in the timeline a little bit and contextualize. So you've got the decision by the American Medical Association to classify, quote, obesity as a disease. This is happening in, was it 2018? It was like 10 years ago, basically, maybe 8, 10 years ago. It's important to understand that that decision was made against the recommendation of the committee to whom the data review and the literature review was assigned. So what this means is the data indicated either that it was, we weren't quite sure, or that the answer was no, it did not rise to the occasion of a disease. And so what that means is that the decision was a political decision. That's what I mean. Like, but if it's not data, then it's political, right? And sometimes they're both. But it's important to understand that, when we sort of have the timeline, there's a lot of places we could start the timeline with GLP-1s, because in some ways, like fatphobia has built the road that would absolutely lead to GLP-1s. But anyway, so let's say we start the timeline with that decision. That creates a very clear pathway, as I'm sure that many of you who have seen GLP-1 advertising has seen. That is their number one marketing phrase. Obesity is a disease. Obesity is a disease. Right. And so, I mean, again, I think what's interesting is you've got this, again, not data-driven decision, but once it's on the books, no one remembers that moment. No one remembers any coverage, and no one even cared that it was against the committee's recommendation. And so anyway, so you've got this like very, very strong branding tool, and no one remembers that it wasn't really a data-driven decision, it was a political decision. So you've got there. And then I think about, as someone who's been, in fat activism for over a decade now, I remember the little seeds along the way, kind of, I'm thinking not too long after the AMA decision, I saw a call by the Tribeca Film Festival. They were looking for short films. They were going to fund them for $30,000 or $50,000 on weight stigma. And I reached out to a filmmaker friend. I was like, let's do it. We're a dream team. You're an amazing filmmaker. I know this topic really well. We absolutely are a shoo-in. And then buried in the fine print, because I wanted to know who funded it. I was like, okay, this is great. Let's do it. But like, who's, and I saw that it was Novo Nordisk. And I was like, oh, I know what they're doing. I'm like, so this strategy of co-opting weight stigma and the language of weight stigma has been there for a long time. So I had a meeting and I was like, I'm disappointed to tell you we can't move forward. I'm not going to be working to create propaganda against higher weight people being used by a pharmaceutical company. So, I mean, that happened. Then there's like, I think of it almost like, as somebody who likes true crime, there's a breadcrumbing effect to the Novo Nordisk story that is deeply creepy. And it's a little bit like, I know that I'm one of a group of people who are the canary in the coal mine, and you don't quite know. I mean, there's a part of me, it's like, I know where some of the story is going, but I don't know where all the story is going. Like if you've seen the show Dope Sick, I think it's close to that narrative. So because the marketing strategy, the aggressive sales tactics are completely exactly the same as the fentanyl, what's now led to this opioid crisis. So obviously different active ingredients, et cetera. But in terms of the potential harm, I think it could be quite large. All that to say, so there's this breadcrumbing thing, right? The AMA, then the sort of Tribeca thing, right? And then I end up, gosh, there was like another little breadcrumb. I'll skip that one because I don't remember it right now. But then let's say at the top of 2020, the top of 2024, I start getting emails from marketers. They're like, hey, we've looked at your social media and we've decided that you're a fantastic candidate for this new medication. In exchange for free medication or for payment, or for access to like some kind of amazing health spa that's like Four Seasons level or something, right? We will give you access to this medication. All we ask in return is that you share your journey with your audience. And I'm just like, what? It's like one of those things where I'm like, I don't even like, normally when a company approaches me, they look at my platform, they're like, are the values aligned? So somebody who's coming to, my whole platform is that all bodies are good bodies. I don't believe in diet culture. I don't believe in intentional weight loss. I wrote a book called You Have the Right to Remain Fat. I'm like the worst candidate. There's no value alignment, which is immediately kind of like a little, the little alarm wasn't going off yet. Cause I was like, oh, this is some weird spam. Then I get another one. I delete that one. I get another one. I delete that one, get another one. The same. They're like literally the same email. I get another one. By around the fourth, I'm like, oh, this is evidence of something. I need to start saving these emails. So I create a folder for these emails and I start collecting them. And then, probably 8 months later, the Washington Post reaches out and they say, we've discovered that these companies have been targeting visible, fat positive, and body positive influencers and are trying to convert them with these deals. And, at that moment, I can even feel it, like the nausea. It's disgusting. Like, I just want to be clear that like, this is completely below the belt, completely unethical. Like not even Coca-Cola markets like this and they kill people. Like, I think about, a very, very simple analogy is it's like Adidas, right? Could go after somebody who loves Adidas. They could go after the person who's not sure if they like Adidas. But this is like going to someone who has a platform based on hating Adidas and they go for that person. This is a very strange marketing strategy. And so what I was realized as I'm talking to like the Washington Post person, the journalist, he's like, do you have evidence? Do you have these emails that you've saved? I'm like, yes, I knew this day was coming. So I was able to send over those things and he was able to find dozens of other people who had gotten these like identical offers. And I think for me, I'll sort of end my part of this answer to this question by saying that, yeah, there was a very, very cynical strategy, right? Like, because most people want to be thin. Most people believe in diet culture. Most people will undertake a weight loss method. That is the majority of the United States. That is not who they went after. They went after the grassroots people who make up a tiny minority. These are people who, by the way, like it's important to understand, right? These are not just higher weight people who don't want to take, GLP-1s. These are people who have been tortured by the culture. These are people who, by virtue of being in a larger body, are likelier to have been prescribed diets as children, which means, and then when you're put on a diet as a child, or any age, you have a 1 in 4 chance of developing an eating disorder, which is a deadly mental illness. So we're talking about a group of people who are highly culturally stigmatized, who have been tortured by people, their peers in their community, who are being refused equal access to medical care, to things like employment. And they're people who are likelier to be prescribed food restriction, and therefore, I would argue, likelier to develop an eating disorder. So this is not a community that's like, I just don't want to take it. This is a community who has been the guinea pig, the #1 guinea pig of diet culture. And in that way, higher weight people are the canary in the coal mine, because we have been the ones that have been targeted. We're the ones who get told by our family members that people are concerned about us. We're the ones who have to know everything about nutrition. We're the ones who have to figure out, what are the dimensions of an airplane seat? Can I comfortably fly somewhere? We're the ones who are experiencing the full trickle down of diet culture. And so for us, I think I just want to emphasize, this is an exceedingly vulnerable population. And that your marketing strategy would rely on predating upon and gaslighting them is disgusting. And I have an old friend who's a lawyer, and he always says, innocent people don't act like this. And whenever I think about their marketing strategy, I'm like, this is just the part they're showing. This is just the tip of the iceberg. What do you think they're doing that we can't see? Because this is horrible. I'm going to end there. I'm getting too excited. Yeah.
Thank you, Virgie.
Yeah.
I think you're right that there's something really perverse about the reversal of values in the targeting of somebody like you, right? Because on the one hand, this fat liberation activism that really did kind of gain mainstream visibility in the 2010s made it clear to people how structural fat phobia is, how intimate its harms can be, how much it warps the lives of larger people, right? And on the other hand, the solution to that is not to get rid of fat people, right? It is to make the difference valued, accessible, understood, to eliminate the barriers to access to things like healthcare and employment faced by fat people, right? And what the Novo Nordisk, this suppose their alleged marketing scheme was doing was saying, we will get rid of discrimination by getting rid of difference, right? Forgive the inevitable failures of this comparison, but it's almost like proposing mass conversion as like a solution to anti-Semitism, right? It's like, no, the solution to anti-Semitism is to value the difference and to stop hating people arbitrarily and create a world where different kinds of people can thrive. And there's something I think like sinister about the logic of that shortcut that strikes me as paradigmatic for a lot of different things right now. But Jessica, I wanted to turn to you because I think you also really had a front row seat to how the beauty and wellness and weight loss industries dealt with the emergence of these drugs after, as Virgie so passionately illustrated to us, also after kind of appropriating the rhetoric of weight loss. Like, how do those industries pivot and how are they operating now to sort of integrate maybe a pretext of body positivity, or how are they now trying to dodge accusations of fat phobia while also trying to make a maximum amount of money off of this new trend?
Yeah. So during that brief reprieve in the media from diet culture when body positivity was sort of like the cause du jour, and it wasn't, socially acceptable, say for like a Cosmo or a Vogue to run a story that was like, here's how to lose 10 pounds. No one, at least in the media, who is responsible for the messaging we put out there, really reckoned with these body standards and beauty standards. What happened was we just refocused them from the neck up, and skincare culture really came in to meet that moment. So now it was fine to have whatever body you have. Your body could be beautiful at any size, but your face could not be beautiful at any age. And really ageism met the moment. And we saw the rise of skincare culture come in and replace diet culture. I always say skincare culture is just dewy diet culture. It's really all of the same values applied in a different way. There's really no ideological difference between fat and wrinkles. These are just features of a normal human body that do not really pose any health problems. They're just stigmatized in a way that makes people believe this is a sign of illness or a sign of injury that must be eliminated. Specifically in 2016, after the election of Donald Trump, there was this big moment of self-care in the media. And they just very slyly swapped the word self for skin, and skincare became self-care. And it really gave us all of this language to justify modifying the body to meet a very impossible ideal as self-care, as health, as wellness, as empowerment, as autonomy. That language really, I think a great example of what's happening with Ozempic right now is it's following the Botox playbook play by play. They're really similar. So both were first developed to treat a health issue, diabetes and muscle eye spasms for Botox in the 70s. Both became more popular for their aesthetic side effects and became more widespread due to off-label usage. Both use systems of discrimination to sort of justify their existence, fatphobia for Ozempic and ageism for Botox, and both say you can avoid being discriminated against if you just look the right way. And for some reason with Botox and all sorts of anti-aging, people just really loved that. And it's sort of become this mainstream messaging and sort of has become this choice feminist thing too, where it's if you critique someone for doing this, you are hating on women, you're doing a misogyny. And it's been really hard to fight back against, as someone who writes about this all the time, I get hate mail constantly. And really Ozempic is just meeting that moment. It's taking the language that skincare culture gave us in that moment of reprieve to justify the beauty ideal as self-care, as health, as wellness, yada, yada, yada. And it's turning that language back toward the body And because we never really dealt with that as a culture of like, this doesn't quite make sense, it makes a really compelling case for like the average consumer who's saying, wait, maybe this is a good way for me to deal with fat phobia.
I feel like I really want to, I wrote the word choice in my little journal and I was like, we need to talk about choice because I think there is this, what I've been trying to formulate the language to be able to understand how to talk about choice. So, I mean, a lot of people obviously are critical of anybody who has any critique of GLP-1s because of the strong sort of health marketing that they've done and some of the evidence that they have. But excuse me. Right? Like, so the choice of the consumer to consume that product becomes the number one priority. And then I'm like, but what about the rights of people who don't want to be targeted for the marketing for this? What about the rights of people who have, eating disorder backgrounds? A person with an eating disorder background should not have to worry about navigating something that could potentially have them relapse. And that should not be the strategy of the company that's selling it. And so I think it's important to understand, right, that like choice is very, very important. And I don't think anybody here would deny the right of someone to take these medications, whether they feel it's for their health or, because they want to offset weight stigma. I mean, there's a plethora of reasons why someone would take this. But I think it's important to understand that that you are actually, as someone who is interested in this medication, you don't need to be in a protected category. The people who are vulnerable to and have been consistently predated upon by and do not want to take these measures are the people that are in the vulnerable population. And I just kind of want to end by saying like the stakes are high. I think it's, anorexia is one of the most deadly mental illnesses. It's important to understand this is not just like some, some kind of like small stake situation.
Yeah, and I'm interested in this notion of choice because I think, it's interesting or it's compelling, or at least it's frequent, right?
Mhm.
To think about consumer choice or personal individual choice in the abstract. And I think that's something all of us would want to defend, right? But in practice, we're looking at a scenario where the availability of these drugs creates some constrained choices, right? It might become more socially costly to exist in a fat body in a context where the availability of these drugs makes that fatness look even more than before like an act of defiance or willful rejection, right? What are some of the ways that, and maybe Jess, you could touch on this first, what are some of the ways that these industries constrain choice, or that a consumer or an individual might find her, or for that matter, his or their choices sort of narrowed by the pervasiveness of these products?
Yeah, I call it aesthetic inflation. So the more normalized a certain beauty standard is, the more people who comply, the higher the pressure to meet that standard for every individual, and the higher the consequences socially, economically, politically for opting out or for not meeting that ideal. I think it's sort of, I mean, I don't know if this is the best example for this particular topic, but I like to illustrate aesthetic inflation by looking at like the contestants on the first season of The Bachelor to today, and look at what was like considered the most beautiful woman you could be to be on this TV show, and the aesthetic labor that was required there versus how much aesthetic labor goes into that same sort of thing today. These are like the most celebrated icons of beauty, So in the past 20 years, especially, there's been a huge shift of what is considered like not only acceptable for the average person, but what is demanded of like our celebrities, who then go on to feed into like the average consumer's idea of what is worthy, what is celebrated, what is accepted. So it's complicated with this concept of choice, because yes, every person's individual choice is their own individual choice, but it also contributes to this collective culture that places more pressure on the people around you even to conform. I always think of my sister in this scenario where She hadn't really thought of like any cosmetic modifications, even though she lives in Los Angeles and is surrounded by it, until her roommate got lip fillers. And then she was like, I think I need lip fillers. So it, like, it all just trickles down, and like the individual choices really do matter. Like individual acts of compliance and individual acts of resistance have like measurable effects on one's community.
Virgie, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I'm thinking about that breadcrumb that I'd forgotten actually is a breadcrumb about Queen Latifah. I got a pitch to cover Queen Latifah was going to come out about her experience as a young woman in Hollywood experiencing weight discrimination. I was really excited as someone who grew up watching Queen Latifah. Queen Latifah was like, you know, she was like one of the only plus size women in media who got the man and the life and the journey, the hero's journey. And so I've been a longtime fan of Queen Latifah as an old millennial. And so I was so excited. I was like, oh my God, I'm going to start Queen Latifah. This is really exciting. Excuse me. Then like, great, cool. Okay, so here's the media kit now. After I've agreed to the interview, and again, it's that fine print, Novo Nordisk. They're like, so she was doing a promotional campaign. I don't even know if these ads actually ever went out. So she's doing a promotional campaign. They sent me the assets, like the 4 little videos that were going to be the ads that were going to be coming out, all featuring Queen Latifah, and they were like mini films. And I watched them, and I need to sit back and just like just shook it. The films were the primary premise was that Queen Latifah is an ER doctor. So we're in the middle of an ER drama. Okay. So like imagine you're dropped in, there's all the sounds that you expect in like an ER, somebody on a gurney, it's a larger body person on a gurney. Queen Latifah is like checking all their vitals, they're bringing them into the room, and then that person's spouse comes in, they're a thin person, and the thin person is standing next to the larger body person who's like passed out unconscious on this gurney. And Queen Latifah looks over at their thin spouse and is like, have you taken weight stigma seriously? This person is a target of weight stigma. Have you been someone who's perpetuated it? And it was like, I was like, what? This is just like banana balls, right? I'm just like, wow. Okay. So I'm, again, as a journalist myself, like being privy to some of the marketing tactics very early on, that they're fully planning to steal the work of fat activism to sell weight loss drugs. And Queen Latifah is doing it. I'm just, man, I feel like my hero. Anyway, but all that to say is like, I'm watching these films, and then I'm, again, that sort of diligently recording them. I'm like, this is all some kind of evidence that's leading to something. And I think that goes back to kind of some of what I think is part of this question, which is, you know, oh my God, I've lost my train of thought. Can you I got too excited
Thinking
again.
about like choice and context, and how
Yes.
there might be renewed or differing pressures on differently bodied
Oh
people.
yes. Okay. Yes. That's, I got it. The train is back. Yeah. So I think, you know, so again, it started to become clear that they were going to use weights. They were going to weaponize weight stigma as a sales tactic. And right in January 2024, they're coming out swinging. They're fully making claims that I'm like, how can they back up these claims? Like they'd have to defy everything we know about weight science. They'd have to defy everything we know about human biology and what you do, what happens when you restrict food in someone long-term. They'd have to defy everything we know to be able to deliver on the claims that they're making. The claims they were making was, we're going to end weight stigma. We don't need the silent thing was, we don't need body positivity. And in fact, we're going to set up these influencers and then tell everybody that they're toxic and that this movement is toxic, because these leaders can't even decide what they really want, because these leaders are lying. Even though only a tiny handful of body positive influencers took those deals that I mentioned about, they knew that at least one would take it, and that would be press worthy. None of the unethical things they're doing are press worthy, but one plus size person turning on their community on Instagram is absolutely newsworthy, and everybody will pick that up. And they knew, statistically, at least one person was going to take that deal, even though these weren't, again, most people who have had a body positive or fat positive platform continue to do so. They have not been deterred. They have said no to these deals. They've been very vocal about not wanting to take these medications. But it only took one or two, right, in order for this to be newsworthy. But going back to the claim that they made, which is that they're going to end weight stigma, my immediate thought as sort of like a feminist theorist person is I'm like, okay, what's the silent part of that promise? How are you going to end weight stigma? Let's continue the analogy. You guys haven't said how you're, but I'm like, so fundamentally, to your point, what they're saying is we're going to end weight stigma by eradicating all fat people, which not only sort of is an offer of a guarantee that this medication will turn every single fat person into a thin person, which it will not. But on top of that, it's that if that outcome were possible, that outcome is positive and it is something that we should be pursuing, which, you know, if we step back is just, it's a claim to eugenics. It's like marketing eugenics. And again, no one's reacting. I'm like, is the New York Times going to cover this eugenics value add garbage these people are trying to propose? No one cared. And so I guess what I'm saying is to continue that forward. So everyone's going to be, so we're going to end weight stigma. Okay, sure. Everyone's going to be on it. Is this now going to create a culture where at what age does this now begin? Is it 3 months? Is it 6 months? Is it 9 months? Is it 2 years that now this child has to be put on this in order for weight stigma to be eradicated? And then how long does a person have to be on it? And no matter how bad it is, if they get off of it, are they going to be accused of promoting weight stigma? I think not only are we in an environment in which I call it a coercive environment, Fatphobia creates a coercive environment in which choosing GLP-1s are not a free choice. It is something that comes with major cultural consequences, and it comes with potentially other consequences. So I think, yes, fundamentally, like there's the potential of this medication and specifically the claims they're making to make the decision to be anti-diet or to be against GLP-1s or to just not want to take them higher stakes than it should be.
I love your point, Virgie, about the influencers, both for how like nefarious it is and how perverse the logic is, but also because it reminds me of something I always try to do in my work and I frequently fail, which is like to critique systems and offer compassion to individuals, like merciless critique for the system and a lot of compassion for the individual, because I think something that is maybe particularly true about weight stigma and anti-fatness is that the people who are the strictest enforcers are often the people who have been targeted by that in the most intimate way, right? Like whenever I'm talking to women about like food or fatness or body politics, somebody always brings up their mom. And I can't tell you how many women have told me some version of like, my mom can't order dessert without doing this whole great self-torture and self-flagellation ritual over whether or not it's morally okay for her to have a piece of cake. And that is something that I think a lot of us have experienced as the policing of our own bodies in a way that is very painful and can feel like a betrayal. But it also comes from what was done to her, you know, and to the world she grew up in, which was so unforgiving of women who fed themselves or who had appetites or who had a pleasure that couldn't be instrumentalized for somebody else's benefit, right? And I'm interested in how both of you guys see people navigating, individuals navigating this fraught intersection that I think is so loaded with body stigma and fat phobia around trying to avoid being hurt and how that can also lead you to hurt others and how to trying to avoid the consequences of stigma and how that can lead us to stigmatize. Jess, have you any thoughts about this?
Yeah, definitely. I think something that makes sense to bring up here is how these drugs, Ozempic, Botox, even just like everyday beauty products are often marketed as pathways to confidence. And I always say like beauty products can only deliver the confidence that beauty standards stole. We focus so much on what we're going to get from the product at the expense of asking, wait, where did that go in the first place? What stole that from me in the first place? And maybe we can focus on that as a solution instead. But I mean, there are products that are called, you know, confidence in a cream. There are products that secure attachment comfort serum is now sold with a copy of a book on attachment style.
Wow.
It's like, it's
So dark.
wild, it's so dark. And I think that like is very pervasive because it makes sense to a lot of people, because we do feel bad about ourselves and our bodies because of beauty culture. And it does seem like a rational choice to say, okay, maybe I won't have to feel so bad if I do X, Y, and Z, if I meet this standard in this way. And I think part of the issue there too is like, we are so focused on sort of the immediate result. Even if there's no like physical change, just doing something that promises to change your body in some way feels good in the moment, because you're like, it's like productivity culture, hustle culture, like I'm doing something, I'm changing myself. That gives you like this boost of adrenaline. I think what we need to look at is over time, what are those effects? And with beauty standards, it shows even if it's marketed as this confidence boost, even if it actually does deliver this confidence boost to you in the moment, over time, these standards and these products and these coping mechanisms are associated with higher instances of appearance-related anxiety, depression, dysmorphia, disordered eating, obsessive behaviors, self-harm, and even suicide. So it's when we think of it as something that's actually going to help us feel better about ourselves, that's a very short reaction. That's a very small moment in time when it actually does make us feel better. And like data bears out that over time, these decisions actually make us feel worse individually and collectively, which is something that I would like to see us focus on more.
Virgie, how about you?
Yes, I have so many thoughts. I mean, I think the first thing I'm thinking about is, it's almost like the cost of riding the ride, right? Like one of the things I really find so overwhelmingly frustrating is it takes more as the marketing gets more and more effective, it takes more and more and more education to decode the language. So something that all of a sudden maybe is, you're like, something doesn't feel right. Like when you tell me you're going to end weight stigma through weight loss medications, I probably feel like something's off, but I don't know how the sort of the analytical steps to be able to tell you exactly why. And so for me, it becomes this sort of classed, almost like cost of entry, where it's like, you have to be this educated, this many hours understanding feminist theory, this many books in order to be able to decode some marketing trash. I think that, so for me, I immediately think of how much labor it takes to learn anything that is critical. And that is, that's its own thing. I mean, I think about, when you first started asking the question, I thought about, I recently did this TV show, and one of the people I was speaking about GLP-1s, and I was essentially saying GLP-1s are not a miracle drug. They are just medical starvation. It's the same. It uses the mechanism of food restriction, period. That's what every single diet in history has ever been. So it does it a little bit differently, but it relies on medical starvation. So I'm making this argument that it's a diet. And, of course, I'm like in the minority, people are booing me and all this stuff, right? And they have like two sets of parents with their children. Both parents want their children on GLP-1s. And they're under 18. And it was really interesting, right? Because like one of the mothers was just like, well, she's in a larger body too. And she wants her daughter to have the most advantages in the society we have. This makes complete sense to me. She's like, and then the other mother has a little bit of a different, cut. But her argument, as I'm saying we need to end weight stigma, she's saying you can't boil the ocean. And I'm fascinated by this, not only because the ocean is boiling, but so I'm like, literally it can, but also I'm also finding, I mean, I understand the sentiment though, right? It's like, don't try to take on, like, this is my plate, don't make my plate bigger, because like this is what I can manage, this is what an individual man. They don't need to take on all of society. I don't need to put that on my child. But I also find it ironic, right? Like I'm sitting there and she's wearing a pantsuit and I'm wearing a pantsuit. And I'm like, well, good thing feminists didn't think they couldn't boil the ocean because we wouldn't be here. We wouldn't be wearing pants right now. And so I think there is like this invisibilization of like the political labor that so many people have put into it. And it's just sort of discarded in some ways. But like, I think, I understand the idea of like, I am not a revolutionary and I'm not raising a revolutionary. That is just too much work for any individual. I completely understand that, understand the perspective. And I think when it comes to what is to be gained from participating in diet culture, honestly, if you don't think about the personal cost of suffering, it's all benefits. It is, you get to assimilate into cultural expectations. You get to be encouraged by your coworkers, family members, and friends. You get to seamlessly participate in social conversations around weight loss, which are ubiquitous in weight loss goals and, like weight loss challenges, et cetera, et cetera. You don't have to be that person who's at work and is like, can we stop talking about people's weight? You don't have to be the sore thumb, quote unquote, who might then lose their job or might then be labeled as problematic. You get the intimacy of relating, right? Like when you think about gender, diet culture and relating about gender is a social gendered performance. And it's a way that people who are socialized female, I would say, and women get to relate to one another and have intimacy. So I think what's as per always, right? Like what the systems offer is seamless belonging at the expense of you, at the expense of your mental and physical health often. And this has always been the trade. I think it's more than just for women. This has always been the trade. This is always the trade with systems. And I'll just leave it there.
I think we're wrapping up and I think we're going to move on to Q&A soon, which I'm really excited for. Thank you all so much for sticking with us through this conversation, which I'm so happy about and pleased with. I think what I'm hearing from both of you is that, the promise of these industries is that we're going to change ourselves enough to become lovable, right? We're going to be beautiful enough and young enough and thin enough. And I think if we can imagine that future where we're changed, maybe we can just expand that utopian imagination a little bit and imagine a future where the world has changed enough that we can all be valued as we are. Can I hear a round of applause for these guys? Because I'm so happy. Now we're going to move on to Q&A. If anybody has any questions and wants to be brave and go first. Yes.
Sorry. I watch reality TV shows, can't remember what it's about. So how have the bachelors or bachelorettes changed in, has it been on for 5 years now?
Yeah, it's probably been on for like 20 years now, close to 20 years, I would say. And I think the point that I was trying to make was season 1, so the premise is you get 25 women competing for the love of one man and they get eliminated week to week. Season 1, these were stunningly beautiful women in like the late 90s, early 2000s. But there was little sort of cosmetic intervention, specifically because like a lot of the injectables and surgeries that are sort of democratized and available to a lot of people today didn't exist or weren't normal. I think if you look at the contestants today, there's like a very, very high amount of aesthetic labor that goes into just the everyday look, not only makeup, but Botox, fillers, a lot of time on fitness, molding this like perfect body that's very slim in the waist, but big in the hips, and you have a butt and you have boobs. I mean, a lot of contestants have gone on record to say that they have breast implants, butt lifts, nose job. I mean, just like the amount of cosmetic labor, the amount of aesthetic labor that is required to be in the public eye today is just so much more than it was, say, 20 years ago. And it was still a lot 20 years ago. And I think it's just like the availability of these interventions that is part of the issue. Even in terms of like money, I would say a lot of this is like available to, a certain class of people. But buy now, pay later is all the rage in aesthetic medicine as well. And there's a lot more people today who are in serious cosmetic debt because surgeons and med spas allow patients to get these procedures. I don't know if it's available for Ozempic or Wegovy yet. But the general trend in aesthetic medicine is, yeah, get it now, pay for it later. You accumulate like tens of thousands of dollars of cosmetic debt. And that becomes like the next fight, the next struggle that you're in for the rest of your life.
Mhm.
In the back,
Thank you so much. This has been super interesting. You talked about how, the marketing and the drugs are sort of meeting the moment. And I wondered if you can talk a little bit about the moment itself and what you think, maybe has created the moment. And if you think, the pandemic had anything to do with the moment and what you think, it may have created if you think it created.
Virgie, do you want to start?
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to tell a story that's kind of a journalism story that I think really illustrates kind of the moment. And I think I think one of the things that's important, that I feel really important to share as just a consumer of media, just being a citizen of the United States or the world, is you know, news media creates narratives. It builds up heroes and then it tears them down. And I think what's challenging is, like, on its best day, journalism gives us balanced information. And I'm not saying that that's not what happens. I think what's challenging is, as journalism becomes more competitive, as it has to compete with all these other sectors, the line between, you know, journalism and just like sensationalist coverage, it just gets thinner and thinner and thinner. So I want to say, like, you know, I think there's the stories that are told in the press that are very different than what's happening on the ground. But I kind of want to address, like, specifically the moment. You know, I think, and it speaks to this, right? Like, what we have is this major ramp up of body positivity, and you've got, like, the fashion industry, you've got all these stakeholders who have bought in. You know, if you can remember just even recently, the PR landscape, like going into Target and being able to see plus size people and like undies, and they've got like a scar, they've, you know, like they've got alopecia, like there's all this body diversity. It's like this incredible, beautiful moment, and everyone is losing their mind, right? Like it's considered disruption. The way that it's being understood by fashion is the word disruption. And it's important to understand, and I hate to say this, though I think there are genuine people who believe in body diversity. When you think about the industry, this was a trend. And this was disruption. And they always knew and were gunning for its end. And I think when you think about that from an industry level, and then you think about it from a journalistic level, again, that ramp up is so juicy, and then the fall. And the fall, I mean, and GLP-1 marketing really created the sort of like the denouement, right? It was like that was the big humiliating, like, to have this movement turned around, exposed, and called toxic by major outlets. I kind of want to say there's a little timeline of journalistic stories that I feel like, as someone who covers plus size news, I was privy to. So you're watching this ramp up of like plus size fashion, right? And coverage and body diversity and like, and all this stuff. And people are clamoring, they're clamoring to kind of jump on this as quickly as possible. Like, companies that had been straight sizes, meaning like extra small through extra large, for years and years and years and years, were extending their lines very, very rapidly. And so that's all important, right? It's like, this is hot, right? Like New York Fashion Week, I remember a few, like 4 years ago, opened with a plus size show, which had never happened before. And it was like this electric moment. And then, and you sort of start to see, like, there's like this build up. And then all of a sudden, right, you get enough bandwagoners that you get people who are increasingly cynical jump on later. Okay, so like the important story, the story that I want to tell is about Gap Inc. So Gap Inc. has multiple holdings, like it's like Banana Republic, Athleta, Old Navy, and Gap. And so part of the whole hubbub was that of Athleta, so Gap was going to turn all of their holdings, all of their little portfolio, into a plus size focused portfolio. They started with Athleta. They did all this marketing research. They found out the plus size customer spent twice as much and was twice as or spent 90% more and was twice as likely to return. So they were like, well, it's just a business case to reorient our entire like strategy towards plus size people. So they got all this stigma training in the C-suite. They did, it was, and then they had body positive training for all the people, all the sales associates on the floor. This was major, right? Then Old Navy was next in the line. Old Navy, I don't know if anybody remembers, they did this huge campaign called #BodyQuality. And they spent a lot of money on it. Like based on the confidence they had from Athleta, they were like, oh my gosh, we're gonna go really hard on Old Navy. And we're gonna like overpromise. We're never going, we're gonna have all plus size stuff in store, which we didn't have before. You're never gonna have to return online. You're gonna be able to return in store. You're gonna be able to try on all the clothes in store. We're never gonna go back. You're gonna have this extended size line in the store forever. And we're so sorry that we ever did bad. Boo-hoo, sorry about that. So they did a massive it was just like a complete sweep. And I ended up covering that. And I was like, something's off. Again, the overpromising thing always leads to problems down the line. So a few months later, the next quarter, the sales numbers come in and they find out that the plus size offering had undersold. And so the CEO of Old Navy went to the Wall Street Journal and said, the plus size customer has failed us. And that got picked up by everybody. And that kind of moment, which not a lot of people noticed, that was the moment that's kind of started the press turn towards thin is in. Very, very rapidly within 3 months, thin is in is starting to trend based on the coverage. It was like the plus size customer failed. We always knew she would. We always secretly hated her. We're so ready to stop doing this. This magical land where, and of course, like the way people are interpreting body positivity, this magical land where women eat ice cream and cake, don't exercise, don't care about their health, and nothing happens to them. That is how this feminist movement is reduced. And in this very sexist kind of condescending, almost like you had your fun, ladies, and now it's time to go back to suffering. And I think the pandemic, I was saying before the talk, the pandemic and all of this, I think this political moment with GLP-1s and Trump feel very connected, where there's like this desire for law and order. There's this desire for, I'm done. I want to feel like I'm in control of my life. And what diet culture has always given, and this kind of goes back to the last question, is the terror management piece. Diet culture has always said, if you do this, you can live forever. If you do this, you'll never be disabled. If you do this, you'll never not be desirable. And so diet culture, even though we kind of know it's a lie, it's the only people in town who are offering the lie again and again and again.
Thank you. Anyone else? Yeah, Archibald?
So, maybe ask me doesn't want to throw on you, that's okay, but I do feel as a bariatric surgeon that I want to just remind us that there is a reason these drugs are useful, and there are millions of people who have tried everything to lose weight, not for aesthetic reasons necessarily, but because of all the other medical problems that for them come with obesity, whether it's joint problems and they can't keep up with their kids or their grandkids, or it's heart disease, or any number of things. And before we had these, really the best option for folks was a major surgery, which again, as a surgeon, like that's what I did. So I benefited from that, but that's a lot for people to go through. And it's actually really incredible that there is a medication now that can offer people who want to lose weight for medical reasons, or whatever reason. I'm actually not judging what reason people have, but that there's an option that doesn't involve permanently altering people's bodies, I think is not to say it's perfect, and I very much appreciate all the criticisms that you laid out so clearly. But there's some good there too, and there always is, which is part of, like, you brought up opioids. I mean, there was pain relief there, and that. So there is a little bit on the other side too. Is all I'm trying to say, that these medications really have helped a lot of people. But your points, like, also can be used inappropriately to meet some cultural standard that isn't helping any of us.
Yeah. And I was going to say, like, I think one of the things that I wanted to kind of lead with and then ended up not saying was, like, I think what's important to understand is always there's a spectrum of risk, right? Like, for me, I often think of myself, I'm advocating for people who are at high risk for weight stigma and high risk for eating disorders. And for me, I'm like, my job is to protect those people. And I think that, right, like there's sort of, again, there's just these varying degrees of risk where I think that, it's almost like I guess there's a point of diminishing returns for some of these folks. And I think what's hard is there are people who meet that standard of point of diminishing returns who are still being pressured and not being taken care of. So, I mean, I think I would agree to that. And I think for me, it's like my job is, how do we advocate for the person who's at and it's not a negligible size of the population. And I think that the last thing I want to share, which I think regarding this, is, it's really difficult to tell what the health outcomes of higher weight people would be in a culture that's saturated with fat phobia. We don't have some kind of control of a society where, a replicated society where there's no fat phobia, because we know that minority stress and stigma are enormous and make enormous impacts on long-term physical and mental health. And I will say, people of the same weight, who are higher weight, who have less internalized stigma, do not have the same outcomes as people who are in the same weight class. So it sort of goes to show that there's some suggestion from the research that stigma is a major mediating factor in mental and physical health.
Thank you. In the back with the turquoise. Yeah, hi.
Taking notes on a lot of things that I didn't know. Just show of hands, I'm just curious, how young were people when they were subjected to like PETA and like that whole movement and like its role with, animal cruelty and like the meat industry and the ethical treatment of animals and like how that related to, I think, current events now. No. It was kind of a long question, sorry. I had a lot in my brain. I guess no further.
I think the
Yeah.
there's a lot of intersection between animal rights movements and like the cosmetics industry and the marketing of like cruelty-free or supposedly more ethically produced
Yeah.
cosmetics and skincare has been like a big trend. And when I was growing up, there was a sort of mystique around vegetarian and veganism, not only for their, moral benefits in reducing animal cruelty, but also for their like supposed weight loss benefits as diets, right? So I think there's a world in which like the rhetorics of justification for these things can get sort of doubled up, right? This is the cream that is morally superior to the other night cream because it wasn't tested on a rabbit. And this is the diet that is morally superior to the other diet because it doesn't rely upon exploitation or killing of animals, and that also will probably help you lose a lot of body fat pretty quickly because you're not actually getting a ton of calories if you're not eating vegetarian or vegan correctly. So I think you're right to intuit a connection there. There's a lot of overlapping rhetorics, and in part I think because the ideology of beauty and weight loss's mandate is so pervasive that you can find it in these like nominally unrelated fields, right? I think it like goes to show the extent of this ideology's reach, that it can infiltrate something even seemingly unrelated like animal welfare.
Okay, cool. I might have a thesis. I appreciate you.
Cool, thank you. I'm so happy to help. Nice, have a good one. Thank you so much for coming. Yes.
To this a bit. But I keep getting really stuck. Every time I'm confronted with another person that I know, usually a very wealthy, maybe already thin person I know who's taking these drugs, who's totally, taken on the language of the marketing of it, which is, I've struggled with body stuff my whole life. I totally get it. It's so hard. And it's meant so much to me to find freedom in that. And the way I found that freedom was by losing weight. And I think I'm also a psychotherapist and I work with eating disorders. And I guess I just don't know how to respond to that. I don't know what to do with that at all. It's partly because in my mind, I'm like, do you hear yourself? But this is such a dominant narrative that, yeah, I'm just curious how, especially how to respond to it in a compassionate way. That's not just my own, rage coming through. Yeah.
I want to hear from both of you on this. Do you want to start, Jess, and we'll go to
Sure.
Virgie?
Yeah, I think something that's helped me in my own personal life, talking to people about this, and then as a journalist talking to readers, is reframing some of our like beauty behaviors as cosmetic coping mechanisms. And we all exist in this system that like punishes our bodies and makes us feel a certain way about what we look like, no matter what we look like. You could be very thin, you could meet the ideal completely, and in your mind, you're terrified of losing that dominance. And your whole life is dedicated to upkeep. You could not meet the ideal at all, and you're confronted with these like punishments politically, economically, socially, every single day, and it takes up so much of your life. And in those contexts, a lot of what we do to our bodies, I think, can be framed as coping. This is the best way that I know how to cope with the situation I find myself in. This is the best way that I can think of with the knowledge that I have right now to cope with the fact that I am obsessed with food and my body and I don't know how to stop thinking about it. And these can sometimes be helpful for a time on an individual level, but they point to a deeper need systemically and collectively. And I think reframing it as like a coping mechanism helps, because it's like, yeah, you need something to cope, but we all sort of know like the best thing would be to not have to cope with this, and what are some actions we can take alongside our individual coping that can help like break open this system for the greater good.
Virgie?
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking, you know, on the one hand, I'm like, well, I think I'm a huge fan of, I don't think there's a right answer, right? I think there's a lot of room for authenticity. Like if it's the right moment to be like, listen, you're gaslighting. I'm feeling gaslit right now. And I know that's not maybe not what you're trying to do, but that's how I'm feeling. I think there has to be space for some level of critique. And again, it goes back to, I'm like, how are the people who are promoting diet culture the ones who need to be coddled? Like there are legit ass people who are like suffering, like literally being refused medical care based on their weight. And how are those people not the people who need to be considered when it comes to mental health? And it goes back to, I think, like stakes, you know, how high stakes is this for you? I think when the phrase I'm kind of thinking of, because I've been thinking about this so much and I've been writing this article for like months and I can't quite finish it. It's about I call it diet culture distress tolerance. And it kind of has to do with like individuating and sort of like building. And I think for me, when I think about, I guess I'll use an anecdote where when I was really new to anti-diet and fat positivity and body liberation principles, I would get extremely triggered by other people. And sometimes the trigger was, oh my God, I'm so wrong. Actually, diets are great. I don't know why I didn't think that. Monday, I'm starting this all over again. It's going to work this time. Yeah. Or the trigger was like, I can't believe it. You're like just so enraged, and like the impotence of like diet culture and how ridiculously stupid and anti-data, anti-science it is, and yet it's still so pervasive. There's like so many reasons to be upset. And so for me, it was like, I don't love the kind of personal resiliency model. I guess in my world, the ideal is that we're fighting for the end of weight stigma as we're developing resiliency to cope with it and the fact that it triggers us all of the time. But in terms of this diet culture distress tolerance, I think for me, it was like, okay, what is upsetting me? What do I need to do? Do I need to self-care? Do I need to like take a few hours off? Do I need to sleep a little bit longer? Do I need to do more research? Is this about a question I have that's lingering and I'm not quite sure, and they're kind of digging into a part that I'm not quite sure about? Do I need to read a little bit of that, some more articles about that, or a book about that or something? And it kind of determines, and I think for me, it was like that. Building distress tolerance was about giving myself all the space from triggers that I needed, setting up boundaries in my life so that I wasn't getting triggered as frequently, me, and then doing the homework that I needed for myself to feel more secure. And as I did that, and it takes years, I think, right? Because you're actively being triggered as you're trying to heal. It's not like the trauma is safely behind you. It is actively occurring. But I think the last thing I'll say is it's gotten to a point for me where similarly, I'm like, this person is suffering. And what can I feel besides just like they're suffering? And it doesn't require me to have empathy. It's just like, there's nothing about this that is enviable. There's nothing about this that's joyful. There's nothing about this that I need to feel threatened by. This person is in it and I am not. And I'm so grateful. And I think that's kind of, you know, I think for me, it's like protecting ourselves, especially if you're like in a larger body or you're at risk of having an eating disorder. We need to protect ourselves from those people. We don't need to worry about them. And that's how I feel. Put on your oxygen mask first.
I think we have time for one more question. Thank you all so much in the back. Yes, we are being recorded for YouTube, so it's gonna be up on YouTube in a couple days. Tell all your friends who weren't able to make it that they can watch it on YouTube, but yes, this is being recorded.
So in that case, for individuals who are in the Fat community, Fat liberation spaces, who might have type 2 diabetes and might be on Ozempic, how can you support people and say, you're experiencing stigma as a person who is fat, you're experiencing stigma as someone with type 2 diabetes, and then now you're experiencing stigma for the life-saving medication that you're on, and for the life-saving medication that you're on within your own liberation community. Simultaneously, I know it's hard to disentangle adiposity from like the experience of fatphobia and fat discrimination in terms of what actually related to health outcomes, but when fat people are navigating this space of like understanding fat health information and like what is good health information versus what are some all or nothing thinking, like there's no relationships between your weight and health versus it's all because of your weight. Like we know that both those statements are actually wrong and it's a complex combination. So like what are your strategies to support people in the fat community while like in the pursuing of health and pursuing information, like tangible ways to do that, other than my strategy, which is just like, you know, health isn't morality, health isn't ethical, health isn't worth, or just being like, you know, here's all the information that I can give you and do with it what you will, and just like supporting all decisions that are made, even if they're made from internalized fat phobia or whatever. Like, what are some tangible strategies you can give people in those situations?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're pointing out something really important, and I agree. Like, I think like every political movement has its like Achilles heel, like kind of the thing that's like the thing, right? And I feel like kind of what's challenging is the black and white thinking that you're talking about, and for good reason, right? It's like we're defending something that is extremely unpopular. So to have a rigid standpoint in relationship to it, it feels natural, but it also hits a point where it's no longer helpful. I think for me, like I see a major difference between Ozempic and GLP-1s. And whenever I'm talking about these things, I always make those distinctions. I think it's worth it if you have the energy to say like these are very different medications. And I think at the end of the day, of course, like ultimately, you know, diabetes management is very, very, very important, whether you're in the fat community or not. I think one of the things that's hard is like Ozempic has become like the headline, right? Like the buzzword, but I always say GLP-1s because they are different from the purpose and intention of Ozempic. I think the other thing that I want to step back and say that is a bigger existential question is, does weight loss work long-term for most people? So, and does it have the consistent health benefits for most people long-term? And this is one of those, again, like it's sort of like you're either a believer that, I guess for me, it's like, I think about it, and when I look at my 12 years of researching weight stigma, of researching weight science, there's a very, very strong case that it is diet culture that is making people larger than their body is capable of sustaining without pulling from other organs. And so at that, if you believe that, if you believe that diet culture is sort of the etiology, like the beginning of this massive thing that we have going on, then when do you call it quits on stopping using weight loss to deal with it? And so I've just talked to, I'll get anecdotal here and say, I've talked to many higher weight people who started out as higher weight kids. Their set point was higher than the BMI than they're supposed to be, but who feel very strongly that without food restriction and weight cycling, that they would not have become the size that they are now, which is not in their set point. Meaning, so when we're all born with a genetic marker of what our ideal weight range is. What diet culture does in general is, and mind you specifically, food restriction, whether it's through GLP-1s or through traditional dieting, what food restriction does over time is it moves your set point up. And the harder you restrict, the higher it goes. So if we know food restriction is the problem, then how is weight loss the answer? So I mean, I guess to conclude, I'm like, there's a point at which we have to kind of call it and say, we're gonna stop using food restriction as a method to deal with a problem that is caused by food restriction. Now, obviously, there's people who would look at the data and have a different conclusion, but I think that's a bigger question that we need to address.
Thank you all so much for coming out. You are a wonderful audience. Thank you so much to Jessica and to Virgie. And thank you all for coming along with us on this really fraught, personal, difficult conversation that I think, we were all able to engage with a lot of grace and curiosity. So I really wanted to thank all of you for being such a generous audience to us. And hope you have a great rest of your night.